So one of the Border Patrol agents asked, "Is it worth risking your life?" And from here, um, he uses this to discuss the notion of the crossing of the border itself. That they can have a high cost, anywhere between, well, right about half an individual's income per any 1 year, with the expense of being crossing the border between $1,500 and $2,500, and again potentially risking death in the crossing overall. And individuals are only making between $3,000 and $5,000 a year. And he talks about some of the push-pull factors that are rather prevalent in migration studies. That um, the emphasis tends to be on individual choice and the push-pull factors that go into that. Um, but as he points out, structurally, from a structural sense, in terms of the opportunities that are available for individuals, staying is not really an option. Both social, political, and economic factors all come into play. And so that staying in San Miguel, you also have the fact that you are putting your life at risk, albeit in a much slower way. And he points out here the impact of U.S. policies, particularly the North American Free Trade Agreement, with the notion of free trade in corn. And you see the United States engaged in underselling, and this is internationally what's known as grain dumping, where the subsidies allow farmers to sell the grain overall to prices that it costs less than it costs to produce. So essentially, you have a situation where, say, it would cost, let's throw out a number here, $5 for a bushel of corn to produce, but because of subsidies, you're able to sell it for $3. And then the question becomes, can other farmers compete with this? And in a lot of cases, the smaller farms in Mexico cannot compete against these lower priced goods. And we've seen this change over time with upswing in things like market speculation regarding biofuels, as there's been a price spike in corn. We see here that some farmers on the milpas in Mexico have been able to return to smaller scale production overall. And so with this, there's relatively overall in San Miguel, there's relatively little money to go around for food to be purchased, or for other necessities that individuals would need for children for their education, such as school uniforms or textbooks or things like that. And so he talks with individuals, and one of them shares that we are field workers, that this is essentially what they do, what they're born into, and what they're essentially going to be doing. It's interesting that 95% of agriculture workers in the United States were born in Mexico, and 52% of those are unauthorized, with 4,000 being deported to Mexico each week. They essentially frame, and the author also frames these individuals as dedicating everything to the fields in the United States, in terms of their labor, their time and energy, their skills, their identities and reputations, and their minds and bodies. Because entering into another country and working in the fields or working in agriculture in general, essentially life in home country is put on hold for income or earning opportunities in the United States, which could be cut short by any series of raids of immigration officials overall. So his book explores ethnographically interrelated hierarchies and processes by which they become normalized and invisible in U.S. agriculture. And so things like ethnicity, issues of labor in agriculture in terms of what it takes to produce the food, and then the suffering that takes place in the actual production of food in the process overall. And he's not alone in this. Steve Striffler's written about this in the context of, for example, Steve Striffler's written about this in the context of Arkansas poultry processing. He goes through and discusses a number of ethnic hierarchies which exist on the farm. And then, so we see here essentially labor segmentation. most of the powerful inputs into the suffering of farm workers are structural. That is not, they're not willed by any one individual agent, but you have different ethnicities which are, there's a hierarchy on the farm which separates ethnicities from one another and has them juxtaposed in relation to one another through conflict. And oftentimes these are tied up as the narrative of ethnic succession. Essentially, the tricky farmers, in this case, the migrants, are paying their dues so that eventually they'll be able to work their way out, come to a higher position overall in the ethnic hierarchy. And we see this in a number of different contexts. There's been some discussion of this in coal mining towns where you see migration switching over time between populations that are potentially of Irish ancestry and then Eastern European ancestry. We see this notion of the Irish progressing over time in towns such as Centralia, and Eastern Europeans, on the other hand, not being treated in the same manner or the same way. So this idea of ethnic succession, and this is the idea that he's trying to bring forth, that Farmer also brings forth this notion of structural violence overall. And so some of these things would be the instructions that would be given to employees to not be as cordial to the pickers or even to acknowledge them, because to do so wastes overall productive time of both them as well as oneself. And there's these narratives that take place about different pickers overall, that the Oaxacans as a whole are less work-oriented, but on the other hand, we see that they're actually replacing mestizos and Mixtec pickers on a lot of these farms. On the other hand, white pickers are under no time pressure, and they have no minimum quantities that they have to meet on a daily basis, just receiving 14 cents a pound, whereas the Oaxacans and others would have to pick a particular amount in order to still be considered a viable employee on the farm. The checkers on the farm often check the quantities of what's grown in the Skagit Valley in Washington, these really beautiful vistas and scenery. And it's not viewed that same way by the individuals who are picking these berries over long periods of time. They look at it and they see the environment in a very different way. A lot of these checkers are high school students, and they'll essentially assess the quality of the berries and be responsible for doing the weighing of the berries, which will ultimately relate to how much the tricky are actually paid for their work on the farm. And it's interesting to think about berries in particular, because we talk about these berries as health foods, the idea of shifting to organic production methods, and potentially that they're going to be machine picked over time. And so even if you have these things that are very healthy for you, health conscious, it's important to considering life cycle analysis and considering the process by which these things come into being. And he goes through and he talks about a number of different vignettes of the suffering of his companions, of the people that he's working with. So he talks about repetitive use syndrome. He talks about this idea of self-medication to deal with insults, and then long-term impacts of pain on Bernardo, and I'll talk about that in just a little bit here. So for Bernardo, he goes in and he talks about his role overall. He talks about the idea that there was he could communicate in broken Spanish. It was really difficult for translations, and there was no medical history that was collected by the physician. So as a medical anthropologist, Seth goes into these various contexts and looks at the work that how these individuals are treated in the context of the medical field as a whole. So he complains of chest pain, and he's admitted to the hospital where a stress test is conducted for the heart, and then more tests are conducted. Now he goes in initially and he simply wants medicine as well as vitamins that will increase his appetite. His request for pain treatment is not noted, and he ends up receiving a $3,000 medical bill. At the same time, clinicians in Mexico are not able to see the social and occupational context, and they ultimately blame the suffering on assumed behavior and culture. And so this becomes part of the naturalizing discourses, that these people act in a particular way, which makes them subject to more disease and more illness, and it's just cultural. And they can't get around that overall. And so biomedicine, he argues, essentially depolitizes sickness. It rips out concerns about things like structural violence and goes to the notion of individual responsibility to explain any sort of suffering as part and parcel of an individual's own failing overall. Key in the ethnography talks quite extensively about some resistance and refusal to comply with some of the ethnic hierarchies on the farm and the injustices which take place on the farm, including a whistling strike that takes place on the farms where individuals cease to pick, indicated through whistling. The lower price per pound that's paid to Turkey harvesters, that they don't receive lunch breaks as a whole, and they receive relatively poor treatment on the farm. And he looks at some of these larger narratives about how multinational food production industries are essentially treating employees and treating human beings, noting things like there's human blood in Coke and Pepsi overall. And he talks about this idea in the context of globalization too, and the movement or migration of peoples, and how individuals are situated quite differently along a spectrum, from international businessmen who travels in a legal and illegally acceptable way to a legal alien farm worker. He notes that a number of individuals on the farm have worked towards bringing in English language classes, as well as programs to decrease the amount of dust on the farm as a whole. And he talks about the need for critical public health and liberation medicine, which would also look at some of the underlying structural issues and will look at dismantling and reforming international economic institutions and supporting local production system overall. So from this ethnographic example, I'd like to move to some of my work in Alaska with a number of co-authors. In 2009, Philip Loring from the University of Saskatchewan and I produced a piece on food security in Alaska, and this was in the context of the heat or eat crisis. We took as a definition of food security access at all times to sufficient, safe, nutritious, preferred, and culturally appropriate foods. And we looked at the notion of what was happening in Alaska in terms of the urban and rural food system and the idea of the interconnections between these. We noted that in Alaskan agriculture, it supplies approximately less than 5% of the state's food, and that 90% of the population as a whole is relying upon the global market for the total year, and 10% for most of the year. It's also interesting to note that Alaska has no food security mechanisms instilled in urban or rural community plans. I'd worked for a while with the Alaska Food Policy Council on developing some of these plans in case of emergency preparedness, the Emergency Preparedness Task Force of the Alaska Food Policy Council, and we had developed a template that has gone through some different iterations, and we're looking at bringing this out not only to urban areas but rural areas as well, or so-called bush Alaska. And the Alaska Food Policy Council has also been active in conducting a number of focus groups or town hall meetings where they've elicited information from different towns and cities throughout Alaska on the state of the overall food system. So the work is continuous and ongoing overall, and certainly issues like little to no food storage has been addressed, as well as reliance on processed food of lower nutritional value. According to reports that we were reading at the time, the USDA in 2008, about 12% of Alaskan households were food insecure, at least at some point of the year, with 5% experiencing severe food insecurity. We also noted that families value country foods or foods that would be harvested from the local region.